Welcome to Living in Fiction. I am your host, Arthur Aguirre. Living in Fiction is an edutainment podcast where we look at some of the best movies, some of our favorite movies, and some ridiculous movies to see what we've learned to avoid, and what's inspired us. I am continuing my rewatch of The Bear Season 1, eventually Season 2. Last week we did episodes 1, 2, and 3, and today we'll be doing episodes 4, 5, and 6. So let's go ahead and get started. So, Episode 4, real quick before I keep going, it's going to be a little bit different today. I know last week I had a major kind of theme or topic and then some subcategories. There was a lot going on, particularly in episodes 5 and 6. So I'm just kind of hitting everything the way that it comes. So just join me on this journey. But let's start with episode 4. Carmi and Richie cater a kid's birthday party for Cicero. Tina and Sydney work to find their footing with one another while Marcus starts thinking about a new project. I am going to skip the kids' party. There's a lot of family dynamics going on there that we could get into, but that wasn't really what I wanted to focus on. Often when I'm looking, or at least I've seen, in terms of the process of what I've been doing thus far through, 3-4 episodes, is I'll rewatch because I've already seen these multiple times. And then I'm basically taking a researcher's approach to it, where I'm looking at either the frequency, so how often something comes up, or the intensity is something that really kind of sticks out to me and leaves an impact in some way, shape, or form. So that's what I'm focusing on, or that's what ends up kind of manifesting here in terms of what I bring on the show. So the big thing or major topic I wanted to cover for episode 4 are the dynamics of leading a new team. And there are a few things that emerge, right? You want to establish a culture. We talked about that a little bit in the first episode. Understanding of the current culture. This is particularly important if you're a new leader or a leader in a new organization. Someone brings you in and you're tasked with changing the organizational culture. Well, it's important for you to understand what that previous culture was like. Meeting and understanding your team members. And then more importantly, something that I always try to tell people to do is you want to meet them where they are, right? You want to meet those team members exactly where they are and not try to push them too far too soon. So the focus for this episode, I would say for this episode is Sydney and Tina, right? There is a unique dynamic in terms of how they are getting along. You see something a little bit similar between her and Richie, but it is much more stark between her and Tina. Their dynamic is a perfect microcosm of what new leadership faces with an established team history. Tina even makes it a point to say, I've been working in this kitchen since before you were born. And so at that point, we heard this a little bit in the last episode that we talked about, where she tells Ibra never trust bitches with little notebooks or something along those lines. And we are seeing that perspective that Tina has on Sydney cloud everything that Sydney does. It feels like no matter what she tries to do, Tina is always trying to just rush her along or give her attitude. At one point, Sydney even tries to help her with the potatoes, shows her maybe an easier way of doing things, maybe a cleaner way of doing things, and Tina just rushes her away. And I bring that up because once things start on that rocky footing, often, unless something major happens, they're going to stay on that footing. It's going to continue down that path. And it reaches a point where you can kind of see the way that they're interacting with each other. Because when you think about a leader trying to help with someone or trying to work with someone who is hesitant to work with them, you often have to come from a place of patience. But because their relationship is already strained, like Sydney is not coming from a place of patience. And Tina isn't coming from a place of openness, which is what you are hoping to get from someone that you're trying to teach. So we're already seeing that causing some sort of problem. But eventually, they do what I think, and what I kind of mentioned before we started getting into this, what you should do is meet people where they are. Right, and that goes, and I want to bring up a thing from Kim Scott, her book Radical Candor, where she says you should go beyond the golden rule. I think we all understand what the golden rule is, where you should treat everybody the way that you would want to be treated, but that's not always going to work. If you are the type of person who believes, hey, if I mess up, I want you to come up to me and say, hey, jackass, you should do that better. That is not going to work for everybody. And so Sydney is trying to figure out the different ways of communicating with the people that are there that she's working with. And it isn't until she meets Tina with that same intensity that you see a little bit of Tina scale back, right? Because two things are happening. One, Sydney finally starts kind of standing up for herself, and simultaneously, Tina is starting to see the actual skill that Sydney has, right? So at one point, Tina has the heat too high on the dish that she's working on. She has to throw it away. You could see that she's frustrated, mostly probably because she has to kind of go back, like, with her tail between her legs to go to Sydney and, I messed up. But by the time she gets back, Sydney has already prepped an entire new setup for her to get started. And she said, "Why did you do that?" She said, "Because I don't have time to fuck around, and you're welcome, chef." Right? So meeting her with that same type of intensity kind of gets them back on equal footing. Next thing I want to talk about is developing leaders, both the skills and the person. And here we're going to focus on Sydney again, but with her and Marcus. So Marcus at this point, because he started looking at some of Carmen's books, suggests making some kind of donut, right? Starts explaining everything and trying to give him the reasons to Sydney why he should be doing this or why he wants to do this. Sydney says, "If you're into it, then I'm into it. Let me know what you need for help." That is such a huge move for a leader to make. I'm going to get into this in the next episode, but giving someone that green light to do something that they're excited about means everything, and it gets them much more motivated. It gets them, the buy-in is so much easier. I know I'll use myself as an example when I'm teaching courses, whether it's undergraduate or graduate level courses, and when it comes to any type of final project or paper, I do what I can to give my students the option to choose what they want to write about, because I've noticed that students get much more excited and jump much deeper and quicker into the research when it is something that they're excited about. It could be very easy for me to just say, "Hey, I want you to write about this particular theory or this particular concept, and I want you to use this particular television show," or whatever it might be. But it's not going to excite everybody. There's going to be some folks who are just like, "Hey, this is my job and this is what my instructor's telling me to do." But some people, that's not how they work. And so giving someone that spark, right, letting that spark turn into a fire for Marcus is a really savvy move for her, right? Because at the end, what if it doesn't work out? Then okay, then he spent a little bit of time trying to create this donut, and it doesn't go anywhere, but at least he was given that green light and he feels excited to be there. So I love that part of what she's doing in terms of building up that skill for him. The other thing, the beginning of the episode, he has her try his chocolate cake and she loves it, right? A little later on, Sydney asks Ibra, "Hey, did you try Marcus's chocolate cake?" He said yes. She says, and instead of talking about the cake, he says, and maybe, he's kind of talking about the cake too, but he says, his response is, "You've given Marcus a lot of confidence. Well done." Tina overhears that. I think that's also part of the reason why her walls kind of start coming down. But that is such a unique answer. I love the Ibra character. But that response of, yeah, the chocolate cake is good, but a lot of that's coming because you're building up this confidence in this team member who they've probably been working together for a while. He is noticing a difference in his character, not just in his skill. And just lastly, a side note, what I love towards the end of the episode is that Marcus is making the donut process. He's getting other people involved, right? He brings Fack, who's not officially part of the team, brings him in to try he's trying, he's pumped about it, right? He's explaining what he wants to do with the donut, all the different things he's thinking about. It's a really fun and creative scene. And I love that he's bringing someone else into his creative process. But for me, the big focus here is Sydney, who is, kind of the de facto leader in this moment while, Carmi's out with Richie at this birthday party. Who is a leader trying to make all this stuff happen. So we see the encouragement she is giving to Marcus, and then we see the development of a relationship with Tina, where at the end, when she gives Tina that encouragement, like, "Oh no, this is great," Tina already, now she has that respect and "Oh, I'm doing good. This person who I've had this tenuous relationship with is still building me up and showing me respect, and now I know even more so she has no reason to give me a false compliment. She likes what I did and I did well," right? So it's not always going to be an easy road when you're trying to deal or lead with someone brand new, but they're clearly you have to read the room, right? You have to understand the different personalities of your team members to figure out how to encourage one or push one or just make someone feel like they're part of the team. So let's move on to episode 5. All right, with episode 5 called Sheridan, we have the restaurant having a ton of issues. First it's the plumbing, then it's the electrical, then it's the gas. We have Carmy and Richie trying to save the meat by trying to take it to Pete and Sugar's house, while Sydney tries to troubleshoot the issues at the shop. I want to preface this whole section by saying, like I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, episodes 5 and 6, I have a ton of stuff to talk about. I'm going to be all over the place, try to organize it as best I could, but just come along with me. I want to start by talking about, there's a video I'll link in the description by the Royal Society for Arts. I use it for a ton of my leadership courses where they talk about motivation. Oftentimes a lot of people think compensation, paying people more is how you motivate them. But there's a ton of research that shows that if it is just manual labor, yes, usually compensation is a way that you get people to work, to be more productive and be more motivated. But once you start bringing in even just a little bit of having like critical thinking or anything along those lines, any type of cognitive effort, there's like a cap to how much compensation can motivate people. And after that, there are 3 things that really motivate people: mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And we see a couple of these things in this episode. So in terms of mastery, the first thing that stuck out to me, Carmen is trying to show, right after the toilet blows up, he takes Tina, Ibra, and Sydney into the kitchen to show them how to make this dish. And he starts explaining all these different ingredients you have to put in. Ibra says, "Many components, Carmen." And he reads exactly what Ibra is getting at, right? Ibra just says many components, Carmen, but in that statement, he is saying, like, this feels very complicated to me. This is all completely brand new. I am not accustomed to this. He says just 3 words, but you can feel all that other stuff behind it. So Carmen responds, he says, I know, just hear me out. We got to get a new dinner menu so we can hire more cooks. I mentioned in the last episode, giving people a why or a purpose, right? Whether it's their purpose or the purpose behind the things that they're doing means a lot. So he is teaching them a new skill, offering that mastery, but he's also giving them that purpose and that why behind it. He's explaining each part, saying that eventually he says, we're going to Monterre, and then he stops himself, right? Because he knows that this is my lingo and from a culture or my community that I'm accustomed to, right? Like the fine dining type of restaurant that this place isn't. And I'm realizing I need to explain this a little bit differently. And so he stops himself. He says, we're going to whisk in about 2 tablespoons of butter, right? So a couple things going on. One, like I said, he's giving the mastery, the purpose, but understanding the culture that you're in and how to reach people through language, right? Language that makes that connection where you understand exactly what I'm getting at. I talk to people about when we are trying to speak to different audiences, it's about encoding and decoding. And it sounds a little complicated, but essentially all that means is if I am trying to explain what I do for work to my mom, I have to package that a little bit differently if I'm talking to my 14-year-old niece, right? It's going to be the same message, but I have to kind of massage things a little bit differently when I'm trying to craft that message to them. That's exactly what Carmen is doing in this instance. In terms of autonomy, we're going back to Marcus, who is still trying to make this donut. He has fully embraced Sydney's support and is learning how to ferment yeast, but we also see in that episode he starts losing focus. He starts doing things, prioritizing that and not focusing on his actual job. And just a quick side note here with Marcus, who is played by Lionel Boyce. I was reading an article by the show creator. What's his name? I have it here. Christopher Storer. And he mentioned that the actor who plays Marcus, Lionel Boyce, actually went to or trained with Richard Hart, who was the former baker for Noma in Copenhagen. Hung out in his bakery, went to Noma, did all of those things because he really wanted to learn, at least a little bit from this guy on how to do all this stuff. So I love that the actual actor got involved with that stuff. But going back to the actual character, we see that autonomy, right? We see maybe a little bit too much autonomy in terms of him, if you're not providing that type of guidance along those lines. We see kind of Carmen, we see Sydney both saying, hey, are you making these cakes? So they're doing their best. But again, this is all a balancing act. But we see that autonomy. And the purpose, more than anything, is slowly getting built through these incremental changes, where Carmen is still trying to provide those guardrails of how things are going and why they're doing the things that they're doing, and also putting people in their specific roles where they can succeed. The next thing I want to talk about is the relationship going on between Carmen and Sugar. But before I talk about that, there's a lot going on in terms of the addiction aspect of the show and the Al-Anon and all of that. I appreciate that aspect of the show being highlighted, right? Or that aspect of Carmen and Sugar's relationship being highlighted. I haven't touched on a lot of it. I know I mentioned the moderator, played by Molly Ringwald in the last episode. But mostly because I'm not a mental health specialist, I don't have a background in that, so I didn't want to comment on that too much just yet. So what I'm focusing on for this episode is the way that they have that argument when Carmen and Richie go over and take the meat to their fridge. And why I wanted to highlight that is because it seems like it's a mess of a conversation, but what Sugar does is actually a really great approach to handling a difficult conversation. The whole thing starts because she kind of throws a jab at him, like, did you know I recently had a brother die too? And they have a conversation upstairs. And she literally says bullet points. You only appear when you need something. You never got back to me about the thing. You've spent every minute since you've been back in that fucking restaurant, and now you're taking advantage of Pete. Oh, and you know how much I hate Richie being here. Oftentimes, when people are avoiding a difficult conversation is because they have no idea how it's going to go. They're worried about what are some things that they might say or they might hear from the other person or how receptive the other person is going to be. The biggest advice I give to people in those situations is have your list of things you want to make sure are said and that the other person understands. So that way, even if things get totally and completely off the rails, right? Because we usually have you have that preemptive thought where you're like, I'm going to go over this conversation, how I think it's going to go based on the way that they've been acting and the things that I've experienced with them before. And then you show up and it doesn't go any way at all. You're ready to fight and they were just completely the opposite of what they normally do, whatever it might be. But there are some things that you probably still wanted to say and that might throw you off guard. So it is great to have some bullet points the way that Sugar does. I know it's kind of off the cuff is what it feels like, but if you are getting into a difficult conversation, that is one of the best things that you can do is have a list of things you want to make sure that the other person knows and understands by the time they're done with that conversation. Next thing I want to talk about is that when it comes to leadership, there are different skills that you usually have to cultivate. There's administrative skills, so just the logistics, the management aspect of things, personal skills, the way you get along with other people, and then conceptual skills, the way you have a vision for where things are going to go, a few months, a year, a few years down the line. You ideally want to be able to develop in all three areas. And in this episode, we get a good glimpse of the skills of different characters. So we see Carmen has really great administrative skills for the most part. We see Richie has pretty decent, from what we've seen across the episodes, we've seen at least the way he gets along with customers. He has very good interpersonal social skills, maybe not, with some of the staff, particularly with Carmen and Sydney. And in this episode in particular, we see a lot of Sydney's great conceptual skills. When everything goes crazy and they lose the gas and or electricity and the gas, they kind of have to go and do things on the fly, and she does that. She does that really well. When the toilet blows up at the very beginning of the episode, Carmen makes it very clear, like, we cannot lose a day of service. And she keeps that in mind. And so when they lose the gas, she is, innovative and takes them outside, asks about if the people are doing construction, across the street, and she figures out a way to make that happen, right? She has that vision of how we're going to make things work. Lastly, I want to talk about here a little bit is accountability and support. So Marcus takes responsibility when he messes up. I think that's really important. Whether you are a team member or whether you are a leader, I think accountability is more important than just about almost anything you can do in terms of leadership development. Right, taking accountability for your wins and your losses. Carmen makes him feel better. She says you got to stay ahead of your work. And then Marcus says, I won't make that mistake again. He says, yeah, you will, but not because you're you, just because shit happens. And then he shares some of his own big mistakes that he made. And there's a moment where he says, there's a moment when you're watching the fire and thinking, if I don't do anything, this place will burn down and all my anxiety will go with it. And then you put out the fire. So I love, there's more to the end of the episode, but I love that that particular scene, because I think we all have those moments of panic where something is happening and the stress of everything is just a little overwhelming, and you think, I just don't want to do this anymore, so I'm just going to let it fall apart. And it's in those moments where you need to just put out the fire and put one foot in front of the other. So that is episode 5. Let's move on to episode 6. In episode 6, called Ceres, we have Marcus, who is still working on his perfect donut. We have Sydney, who comes up with a new dish and tries to get it added to the menu. Carmen and Sugar continue to work out their personal issues while looking for documents needed for the shop's taxes. And Richie struggles to find his place in his new system. I love that we get a glimpse of Michael for the first time and what their relationship's like. We also get an idea of where Richie gets a lot of his storytelling kind of approach to telling stories, and we even see him trying to tell that exact same story on a first date, and it just does not go well. And I think it highlights the fact that he is still trying to do things the way that he's accustomed to and the way he thinks Michael would do them, and that it's not landing the way it did with Michael. And that's why I wanted to focus on authenticity, right? And it's important as a leader that you're authentic. When I talk to people about authenticity, I like talking about Bill Belichick, the coach for the Patriots, because for a very long time, people saw his success in the NFL and wanted to replicate that by hiring one of his offensive or defensive coordinators, and it rarely, if ever, has worked out. And it was typically because often these folks would show up and they would try to be like Bill Belichick, and that's just not a way of being a good leader. It's not that you have to be authentic. It's good. I think a lot of us should think about leaders that we like and respect, and we pull different pieces from them. Like, I like the way they did this, I didn't like the way they do that, and then you make them your own. And I like using that example because oftentimes those folks weren't making it their own. They were trying to repeat the same process of what worked previously, and it just wasn't working with them. Another aspect that I saw in this was patience, where we are seeing Carmen trying as a both forceful but delicate way of telling Sydney that she needs to be more patient. He can see the talent, but it's his job as a leader to develop her in the right way and in a way that he respects. As we see these little snapshots of the way that he was treated, and you can tell he doesn't want to do that. So he's taking a different approach. He is letting her know, like, here's some things you need to work on, that you are very green and you are very impatient. So here's some things that you need to work on. And she doesn't, right? So she makes a cola braised short ribs with risotto. Everyone likes them. Carmen says they're tremendous, but not ready yet. And she intentionally sends them to the critic that she knew was there, right? Because we hear at the episode, we have a VIP on this table, and they send it to her. So she knows exactly, despite what Carmen said, she still did whatever she wanted to do. And you can see two sides to that. One, shooting your shot, right? There, I love, Shea Serrano's one of my favorite writers. I love that he'll post that all the time, make sure you're shooting your shot. And that's what she's trying to do. But there are different ways of doing that. And she's doing that at the expense of possibly her relationship with Carmen, maybe even her place in the restaurant. So and for Carmen, that puts him in a tricky situation, which we'll see in later episodes. But patience is incredibly important, and instilling the importance of patience on the people that you're working with. Going back to purpose, we really see Richie struggling. We see it at the very beginning of the episode, but we see at one point him and Sydney are in the kitchen, and he's telling her this is a delicate ecosystem, and it's held together by a shared history and love and respect. And he gets cut off, but he says something very similar to Tina. He's trying to tell a story to her, but she's working, and Sydney's trying to call his name to stop him from bothering Tina. He kind of goes off on her. Tina takes him outside. She tells him to go home, and he's confused because he thought, at the very least, because he had seen probably the tension between Sydney and Tina, that Tina would be on his side. But she says, I've improved my shit 300% in just 2 months. And that the place is organized. And she says, I love Michael. You know how much I love that kid, but this is real and alive and good. It's good. Richie says, they're kids. They don't understand. She's a baby. This is a delicate fucking ecosystem. I don't need this shit right now. I'm going to quit. Tina says, quit, and where are you going to go, Richie? and it kind of flashes back to the very beginning of the episode with Michael. So we can see this tension with Richie, and that's tough, right? Anytime you're trying to do something new, there are going to be some folks who are going, regardless of how good it might be, they're going to dig their heels in because they don't want to do that. And we're seeing that a little bit with Richie. Really, in terms of how you build those people along, is you try to ask them, like, what is it that you're hesitant about? What are some ways that you can feel more included? What are some aspects of the old culture, the old way of doing things that might fit into this culture? Those are some suggestions. Obviously, there's like a family dynamic involved between, you know, Carmen and Richie, but those are just some suggestions if they don't have that dynamic that could be useful. We also see different ways of handling conflict, where Richie, again, thinks that his way of doing things and his system and what he's done in the past is going to work. And Sydney shows that there's a new, better, more calm way of doing things, right? Creating these connections in the community through food, through what they're doing, than with the threat of violence. So we see more aspects of Richie realizing that maybe the way that things were done before don't have to be the way we do things now. One of the last things I want to talk about, because I have folks have asked me before, what does leadership coaching look like? And we don't see any actual coaching here, but in the conversation that Richie or that Carmen and Sugar have in the office can shed a little bit of light on what coaching might look like. They have this heart to heart, and Sugar says, all our time and money and work gets sucked up into this place. The only thing we get back is chaos, resentment. It's bullshit. Carmen says, it sounds like mom. And you know, you get at the heart of some of these issues, but you don't know that until you start having these difficult conversations. And that's what coaching is all about, right? You would ask these questions about, why are you feeling this way? What are some things that are coming up? Why is this issue so important to you? And then having someone bring that up and say, hey, this sounds a lot like something you've experienced before. And so you start seeing the connections between why something might be challenging for you. And it's deeper than just, oh, well, I don't like that you're always at the restaurant, because that's not really what the issue is. So it's kind of a roundabout way of seeing what coaching is all about. But that's really what it is all about. Is in these coaching sessions, you're having these conversations and you're asking these questions of your clients and getting to the heart of what some of these issues are, so you can really start helping someone on their own be able to figure these things out. Lastly, on some communication odds and ends, I love that Manny shows up and he is very clear in his message. He says, take the green labels off the dishes before they get to the washers, because it makes it harder for them to do their jobs, right? Here's what I'm asking you to do. Here's why I'm asking you to do it. Sweeps assumes that Marcus is sleeping or sees that Marcus is staying in the restaurant. And he finds this really cool way of saying, like, hey, if you need anything, like a place to stay, just let me know. And also tells a story of how he's been in that situation before. I think that's a really great way of connecting with someone, not making them feel less than, and explain that you've been in those situations before, and offering him, you know, some help. I thought that was great. I think words have meaning, I think was a really great lesson for me on this one. We've talked about this before, how we make connections through communication. Richie shares how his daughter asks if his last name is Bad News because his ex-wife has him in her phone as Richie Bad News, and that his ex-wife says that, or his ex, I should say, says that he's contagious. I bring all this up because the way that we talk about people, the way that we talk about things, it matters. If you are thinking about your romantic partner, and when we talk about the conflicts that you all have, and you call them fights instead of arguments, or why are you always battling me, or why are we always going down this path? All those different words and metaphors that you're using are indicative of how you think about that relationship. And whether it's your romantic relationship, your coworkers, your friends, all of those things, the language that we use is really important. So if we keep talking about someone in a particular way, it can be really detrimental and really hurtful for that person. And we're seeing that in, you know, Richie, who's already dealing with all this change at work, is also having to think back to the way that some of the people who are closest to him are talking about him. Last thing I want to talk about is this idea of that you should keep pushing. And I bring that up because when Carmen and Richie are talking out back, Carmen says, is there a name for that thing where you're afraid of something good happening because you think something bad's going to happen? Richie says, I don't know, life. And this one really struck a chord with me because there is I won't get into all the details, but there is a pattern in my life since, I don't know, about 2011 where something really great will happen to me, and within a day or a week, something catastrophic happens to me. And it kind of builds this pattern in your brain of like you avoid or get hesitant for something good to happen because something bad always happens right afterwards. But you can't let those things stop the optimism and excitement that builds for those good things. And it can be really challenging and it can be really difficult. And man, fighting that anxiety can be really hard. But you're closing off those opportunities for excitement and for what life is really about if you were just letting all that hesitation and anxiety get in the way. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, that you can completely stave off those feelings. But I think, the thing that you learn in therapy all the time, right? The difference between reality and what's real, right? Like that anxiety, those feelings of hesitation and trepidation, like those are real feelings. But the reality is those things haven't happened. That bad thing you're anticipating hasn't happened yet. So get excited for those good things when they're happening. If you want to prepare a little bit for what might happen if there's a negative thing that happens afterwards, great. But you should really try to focus on those positives because they can make all the difference in the world. So those are episodes 4, 5, and 6. Join us next week where I'll be going over episodes 7, 8, and 9.